All right, so we are still in the later Middle Ages, roughly from the year 800 to 1200. We'll actually extend a little bit past 1200 today in some of the things that we're looking at. I want to remind you that a week from this Friday is the next primary source essay being due. 2 weeks from Friday is when the Rule of Faith reflection essay is due. So make sure to those both completed before Thanksgiving, and then after Thanksgiving, it's the last set of summaries, the last primary source reflection essay, and the final. So coming up pretty quickly towards the end. So our focus today will primarily be on doctrinal developments in the later Middle Ages, mostly focusing on some things that were new, developments in doctrine. We'll touch on some that are just kind of some modifications of previous doctrines, but there were several developments in the later part of the Middle Ages that had a significant impact on that time and continuing after. One of the first major doctrinal developments I want to focus on has to do with a rather complete separation between East and West. Now, by the later Middle Ages, tensions had been splitting Christians in both, from East from West. And those tensions have been political, related to the issue of the emperor. It had been cultural, between the Latin West and the Greek East. There had been military issues, but there had also been some doctrinal issues. Two of the major doctrinal issues had to do with the Nicene Creed, and then some things related to the Pope and some other things. But one of the major things that develops toward the middle of the Middle Ages had to do with the Latin word filioque. Now, essentially, it was an issue related to the addition of this word to the Nicene Creed, the creed that's come out of Nicaea related to the divinity of Jesus. And the split really began to come into focus with the patriarchate of a man named Photius. Photius became patriarch of Constantinople in the middle of the 800s, after there had been problems with a previous patriarch named Ignatius. Now there's some confusion. Apparently there was confusion then, and there's still some confusion as to whether Ignatius resigned the patriarchy or he had been taken out of it by the emperor, for example. Well, as Photius became patriarch, there were a lot of questions related to not only Ignatius and whether he was still patriarch or not, but whether Photius was even qualified to be a patriarch, let alone a bishop, which was necessary as well. An appeal was made to Pope Nicholas in Rome to try and help out this issue. He sides with Ignatius, who kind of returns to the patriarchy and doesn't recognize Photius as being a true patriarch. Of course, this is, it makes Photius furious. In addition, around the same time, there are other things occurring from the West that are adding to these tensions. Missionaries would come from the Latin side of Europe into the East and trying to convince Orthodox Christians to accept the Latin rites, meaning doing things the way the Latin Church, the Roman Catholic Church did, adopting other customs, adopting the Latin language. Around the same time as well, the Nicene Creed in the West was edited to include this word filioque. Not really sure exactly where it developed. Apparently in Spain is what a lot of historians believe. This is where Ferguson falls down on. And eventually it makes its way into the Frankish kingdom. And from there it makes its way to the east. A lot of this is related to the issue of the Holy Spirit and where the Holy Spirit proceeds from. So from whom does the Holy Spirit proceed? Originally the Creed said it proceeded from the Father. The addition of the word Filioque said that the Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. Now again, by our estimate, it might not seem to be that big of a deal. Right? And in some ways we could argue, well, Jesus does talk about how he's going to send the Spirit. So in a sense, it does make scriptural sense to say that he proceeds from the Father and the Son. But for the Greeks, this was to be tampering with the Nicene Creed, and doing it in a way that wasn't reflective of the decision of a church council, but with the decision of a group of people, particularly a group that they were in tension with. By the time of Charlemagne, the recitation of the Nicene Creed with the Filioque was quite common. And so when some Frankish monks are visiting the Eastern Empire and reciting the Creed, they included this phrase, or this word, and many were concerned. Because here are these Franks, and evidently they've decided to revise the Creed, and who gives them the right to do this? So this was tampering with the Creed. It was also confusing the work of the different persons of the Trinity for the Easterners. Now, one of the things that we emphasized is, why do so many Christological controversies develop in the East when there's not so much in the West? Well, for the Easterners, they wanted very clear, concise developments and distinctions between the persons of the Godhead, what they did, and there's that holdover from Greek philosophy that a lot of people are imbibing that wants these clear, careful distinctions. So for them, the Father was the supreme cause of all things, and that the Father is the one who causes all things to be. The Son is begotten by the Father, not created, but begotten, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father for the Easterners. The danger they felt was that if you say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, that confuses it. There's a difference because the Father has only one Son, not two. Right? So the Son is begotten by the Father, the Spirit proceeds from the Father. Now, essentially, to say that the Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, for a lot of Eastern Christians, was to suggest that there were two sources of divinity, the Father and the Son, which there is only one source of divinity for the Easterners, the Father. Again, we might contemporaries say, well, I don't think that necessarily means there's three or two or any sort of plurality, but for the Easterners, they felt this way. And so Photius pointed to this as one of the heresies in the West. Eventually, he becomes patriarch a second time, and this time is recognized by the West. And around the same time as well, because of this outcry from the East, Westerners started going back to reciting the older Apostles' Creed rather than the Nicene Creed as a way to kind of compromise this. There were other disagreements between East and West, some of which were doctrinal, some of which were related to practice. Things over clerical celibacy, for example. Bishops in the East were expected to be unmarried, but priests could be married. In the West, of course, as we talked about, there was that consistent refrain of clerical celibacy, eventually becoming, in the later Middle Ages, the commonplace. There was also the use of there was also the question of what kind of bread should be used in the Eucharist. The West tended to use unleavened bread, believing that with Jesus instituting communion, the Eucharist, during the Lord's Supper, during Passover, that the bread that was used was unleavened bread, and so that was the type of bread that was to be used. In the East, however, they believed that the bread that should be used during the Eucharist was common table bread that you would find at any sort of meal, claiming that the word used in the Gospels meant a common table bread and didn't mean necessarily unleavened bread. And so the West, using unleavened bread, was no better than the Jews in their eyes. Furthermore, the West, in the eyes of the East, did not forbid eating strangled meat. Right? And so eating meat with the blood still in it, which was a problem as well. Furthermore, kind of related to the controversy over icons and images, the West continued to depict Jesus as a lamb in some artwork, the East believing, no, he should be depicted as a man, and it should not be depicted symbolically. Eventually, this tension erupted in what's sometimes referred to as the Great Schism or the Great East-West Schism, occurring in the year 1054. There were a couple of major individuals involved in this that we'll talk about here and the roles they played. Leo IX, of course, was born Bruno. This is Bruno of Toul, who had been that great reforming pope that we talked about last week. And we mentioned that towards the end of his life, he is captured and held hostage or held prisoner by the Normans. While he's held prisoner, the Byzantines kind of stand back. They don't really come in to help him. They just kind of let the Normans, who again are the descendants of the Vikings, just kind of do whatever for Rome. Additionally, there were some churches that used the Latin liturgy in the East, and at the same time, they were closed down. All right, so you're not helping the Pope. You're closing down any churches that use Latin liturgy. And so when Leo's finally released, he's kind of upset, as you might expect, both from being held prisoner, but also from what has happened in the East. So he publishes some writings, but, he's kind of, let's see, he doesn't close the Greek churches. Right? And so he's saying, I won't go that far. But, he starts, kind of condemning the view of clerical marriage, that you could be married in a priest. He condemns the fact that a lot of Orthodox churches would rebaptize people if they were following the Catholic rite and then decided they wanted to be following the Eastern Greek Orthodox rite. That they were waiting until the 8th day to baptize children instead of baptizing them immediately after birth or pretty soon after birth. So although he doesn't go as far as the East in kind of shutting off the Greek churches in the West, he does condemn a lot of things done in the East. Rome was the mother church in Leo's eyes. Anyone that departed from the way of Rome was essentially a synagogue of Satan in his eyes. Constantine X, who is the emperor at the time in the East, tries to step in and encourage reunification. And let's unify here together. So Leo IX sends a cardinal named Humbert as his representative to the Patriarch of Constantinople, a man named Michael Cerularius. So the two are kind of meant to meet, discuss this. So there's issues of theology that are debated, there's issues of politics that are discussed as well, and the two groups can't come to an agreement on many of the issues that separate them. So while worship is going on in the Hagia Sophia one day, Humbert comes in with a papal bull of excommunication. A bull is a type of document from the Pope. And so this document essentially excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, removed him from the church. And so while worship is going on, here comes Cardinal Humbert with this document, this papal document, sets it on the altar, and then leaves. So after this, Cerularius decides to excommunicate Humbert and the entire papal delegation that had come to visit him. Leo, however, died before learning all of this. So he did not know that the bull had been delivered. He did not know that his delegation had been had been excommunicated as well. Since that time, the two churches, the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, have been separate. There have been a few times in their history that there have been attempts at reunification, but nothing major and nothing that's ever really come about. At various times, of course, popes have gone back and said, well, we're going to revoke the bull of excommunication. So the relationships are kind of cordial. Often popes will meet with the Patriarch of Constantinople, especially as they become pope or as they travel to Turkey or something like that. And furthermore, a lot of the stuff that was going on in these upper levels didn't really reach down into the local churches. Relatively few really knew, or once they knew, understood what was going on in all of this. Probably more of an impact than on common people had to do with the solidification of the break in the 1200s with the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, like the other Crusades, was intended to go into the Holy Land, bring about some freedom there, but most of the Crusaders stopped off in the Byzantine Empire, looted churches, kicked the Patriarch of Constantinople out, established Latin liturgy churches, right, forced everybody to follow the Latin liturgy. So you could understand why that would kind of upset a lot of Byzantines. What questions do you have? What comments? Anything that we need to clarify?
This hostility between the churches, was that reflected in calling people against each other?
Not in any sort of grand way, because there wasn't too much of a interaction with them, but probably for the Byzantines that lived in Constantinople, because of the actions of the Crusaders, there was more of that, since they actually went through that experience rather than other people in the empire. And relatively speaking, pretty soon after this, Muslims are knocking at the door, starting to push into what's modern-day Turkey, and so that kind of changed a lot of things for common people as well.